This morning's topic isn't quite usual. It's as much informational as it is a sermon or a posture, although my own point of view will creep through, so don't pretend that this is fully objective. There will be a lot of time for discussion. Greg talked about a first opportunity, and there will be others as well. Our denomination, as represented by its association, the Unitarian Universalist Association, or the UUA, has proposed to change the language we use in order to describe ourselves. The process involves amending a section of the bylaws, which we require ourselves to do on a regular basis. The proposed amendments will be voted on at this summer's General Assembly, and they represent major change. Notably, this includes replacing the familiar 7 principles and sources with a statement of values. The 7 principles you probably know well. They appear on the back of our order of service. The principles, along with the sources, which are an associated part, appear in our hymnal as well. Understandably, there are strong feelings about this, and we want Beverly Unitarian to have an opportunity to weigh in. So this morning, I will try to state the proposed change and describe some of the feelings I have heard expressed, motivating it, and in part opposing it. I will also try something which right now is very difficult, which is to unpack this proposal from some of the other political currents that are active in the national UU discussion. If you heard Greg speak, he was not secret about the fact that there's some tensions. And so I hope this sermon will serve as a kickoff for discussions within this group. As I just said, I'm hoping to avoid questions about political dissension and disaffection within the UUA. I acknowledge there are serious rifts, that there has been either a very controlling rollout of this proposal or censorship in terms of opposition to it or candid discussion about it, and that's unsettling in our open and ostensibly transparent religious community. But that's not where I want to go today. And unfortunately, some of the people involved are very angry for a lot of reasons other than just this proposal. And that's why it gets pretty complex. But I will try to limit this talking to the one topic, which is the proposed changes. All of you should have a piece of paper. I've given out several things like this before. Everything's a living document. It keeps changing in minor ways. But this paper is the currently proposed version for the Article 2 revision. Article 2, just to make it clear, is the first section in our bylaws, where we say what we're about, describes our purposes, principles, and really puts forth our reason for being a religious association and a denomination. The first version of the principles were created back in 1961 when Unitarians and Universalists merged. They wanted a statement that said what we are, what we're about. As I said, the Article 2 is a living, breathing part of life. It has been changed on a few occasions. The major change happened in 1985, I guess it was, where the original 6 principles were reorganized. A 7th principle about respect for the interdependent web of all life, of which we are a part, was added. Initially, it was added as the environmental ecological principle, but it also became much more than that, talking about interrelation of all affairs in human and non-human life. And The sources were broken out from a couple of the initial principles and separated and created. And the language was degendered. There was a lot of man and he and stuff like that in the originals, and that no longer sold in the UU world in 1985. Since then, they've been pretty static. I don't know if there have been any changes or not. I think there was something little. So for over 40 years, they've been with us and they've served us really well. We refer to them every Sunday morning here. People have little cards with the principles on them, and they use them to introduce outsiders to what UUs hold in common. These are not ideas that are uniquely UU. We don't own the ideas. Indeed, most of the philosophy espoused in the 7 principles goes back to the Enlightenment, an Enlightenment philosophy that was prevalent at the foundation of this nation. Much of the similar language shows up in the US Constitution and founding documents in our country. But as a collection, the 7 principles are impressive, and I particularly always highlight 3. The first one, which is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That's a very strong statement. It says that we are inherently worthy. We are inherently we have dignity. It doesn't say everything we do is worthy or everything we do is dignified, but it says that people are inherently worthy. And the 7th, which I just mentioned, which is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Those are sort of the brackets. Those are the bookends. One says every individual is important. The other one says we are all connected to everything around us. And then there are other principles. The one that's uniquely UU of all of the 7 is the 4th principle, which is that we affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. There is no dogma, there is no creed in Unitarian Universalism. Each individual is encouraged, and I might even say charged, to try to figure things out in a way that makes sense to them. We've gotten a lot of mileage out of these principles and the sources. So the question comes to bear about why change? Why change these things that are very important to some of us? And I can't give good answers. I'll give a couple. First is we're required to revisit them every 15 years and see if they just really speak to where we are today. If these are the things that describe fundamentally what we represent as a church. In the words of a very important UU theologian, James Luther Adams, revelation is continuous. In most religions, it's fixed in many ways, the dogma at least. The relationship to the eternal is fixed. It's described, it's told you, taught by the church. For us, how we understand and how we know, we expect to always be changing. And our ways of knowing shift with new discoveries, cultural changes, and just changes in the way we see things. Second, the principles have been challenged over time in several ways. The most visible of late was an 8th principle project, which was brought forth, I don't know, about 5 years ago. It attempted to add a new principle that explicitly addresses a commitment to anti-racism and anti-oppression work. Some people thought this is sort of redundant, that the other principles should say that we're in support of racial justice and commit us to work for justice. But the claim by the people pushing the 8th principle was obviously it hadn't been enough because racism still persisted within our nation, within our culture, and according to many, within our denomination. So that was a very strong proposal. It was adopted by many congregations independent of the UUA process, but it never came to a UUA vote because it got drawn in to this revision process. And indeed, some of the terminology from the proposed eighth principle is in the new proposed document. Another critique of the principles is that going back to Enlightenment philosophy and whatever else, they very clearly address the individual, the rights and responsibilities of persons, but they give much weaker guidance about collective group activity, which in many ways is odd for a document that's defining a group. Otherwise, are we Unitarian Universalists a collection of individuals? Or are there certain binds and ties and consistent things that hold us together and that we're in pursuit of other than individual fulfillment and growth? Anyhow, the UUA appointed an Article 2 study group, which is how we do such things. How do you do anything? You make a committee, right? And this Article 2 study group was given a very broad but specific charge both. They were told, don't worry about anything. Don't worry about what exists. Just figure out how you think we should say things. And by the way, make sure we address some of these issues, particularly those involving racial justice and the plight of marginalized peoples in our denomination and in the world. So I'm going to get a little confused here as I jump around between different things in paper. Many things came up in this group. It was actually a pretty nice group. Included some well-respected and well-known voices, as well as some unknown youth representatives and other people. And I'll just read a thing or two from their report about sort of how their mindset was working. The principles express a shared ethic and imply a certain theology, one that values the individual, growth, the natural world, and diversity. But it does not name these values explicitly, nor does it name many other values important to us collectively. It also gives no guidance on how we might approach living out these values in our congregations and in the world. It declares itself to be a covenant, but the only actions it asks of congregations of a covenantal nature are to affirm and promote the 7 principles. We believe we should expect more from a covenant. As one member puts it, we need more verbs. And that's a thought. Is a statement of principles a sufficient basis for founding religious movement? They thought no, others think yes, and hence the discussion. What they came up with is what you have in front of you. They reorganized the whole thing a little bit. They put in a little section on just an organizational, if you look at the thing I handed out, Section C1 purposes, that's actually new, but it's just a statement of what the organization, the Unitarian Universalist Association, is charged with doing. And it ends, though, with a fairly leading sentence, which says the Unitarian Universalist Association will actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through creating love. And this is a very theological statement. It's saying that what we're about is transformation. And however we go about that, whatever we do, somehow central to this, it's supposed to emanate out of a sense of love. Then they move forward. And there are many points here, and we can do some wordsmithing, and we might have to come back and do a little. But they move forward, and I'm going to just read the initial part of section C-2.2. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant, congregation to congregation, and through our association, to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritage of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values are, and I won't read the subtext here, but that they are interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity. Now, if we look at these, each one is described a little bit and leads to a covenantal statement. For example, the interdependence one pretty much picks up on the old seventh principle and says, we honor the interdependent web of all existence. Then I'm going to skip ahead. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships, etc. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. So it's asking something of us. It's saying we agree that this is what we're about, doing this stuff. Under pluralism, we celebrate that all sacred beings, diverse in culture, or that all are sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences in communities with love, curiosity, and respect. So you get the notion of how this works. There's a word, a value, a statement, and a covenant. Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes. Transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. That's what we ask of ourselves. Openness to change is fundamental to our heritage. Generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. And then we covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. So that's how the new thing is organized. And it's not quite as poetic as they'd hoped. Neither were the 7 principles. In fact, one of the things they were asked to try was to figure out if they could come up with slightly more poetic language. I don't think they succeeded. The next section, and I'm going to slow down here in a minute, but is inspirations. And this replaces the sources. And I don't know how many of you were familiar with the 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism that were in the previous article too, but it started out with our Christian and Jewish heritage from where we come from, and it went on to many other things. This is a much more general statement. It doesn't name any specific religions. One of the criticisms was where things like Buddhism and Taoism and Islam were not mentioned, but Christianity and Judaism were. And yes, we came from those, but The others are important to many UUs, as are other religious traditions. This is a more general statement. It just says direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder are primary sources of Unitarian Universalist inspiration. These experiences open our hearts, renew our spirits, and transform our lives. We draw upon and are inspired by sacred, secular, and scientific understandings that help us make meaning and live into our values. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which these sources were created and are currently practiced. Grateful for the experiences that move us, aware of the religious ancestries we inherit, and enlivened by the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. I think this is the case where I think they made the greatest improvement. This language is rather poetic, and it's very sweeping and broad. And then the last two sections are not identical, but they replace things that existed in the previous article too. The inclusion section is fairly close to what was there with two important additions. One, and this is something that's worth hearing, we strive to be an association of congregations that truly welcome all persons, and that's where the last one stopped. And this one says, who share our values. So that is a constraining, limiting thing. It's saying you use our people that can agree to this basic value package. And the other says, we commit to being an association of congregations that empower and enhances everyone's participation, which was in the last one, and then adds especially those with historically marginalized identities. And the final thing I will mention here is under freedom of belief, congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience are central to our Unitarian Universalist heritage. Congregations may establish statements of purpose, covenants, and bonds of union, so long as they do not require that members adhere to a particular creed. So this is saying, this is the non-creedalism aspect of Unitarian Universalism. However, several things here have raised questions among some of the opponents of this. Among other, I will frequently read the statement that this new thing abandons our commitment to individual freedom of belief and threatens congregational autonomy. That's the lead sentence on the website of the Save the Seven Principles organization. Many people, the old language, which was very legalistic and clumsy, did specifically say, nothing shall be deemed to infringe upon the individual freedom of belief. Said that very directly. This one says, congregational freedom and the individual's right of conscience are central to our heritage. Are we not? I mean, some people see that as abandoning a commitment. I don't really see it that way, but that's me. I don't feel threatened. Others do. Going back and considering this, and many things in here are trigger words for, I will call it the loyal opposition. And some of those trigger words are covenant. Covenant has a mixed history in religious life. On the one hand, and I've talked about this up here before, we are covenantal in nature. I can't see any other way. We can use a different word, but I can't see any other way we describe how we hold ourselves together. We make promises to behave in certain ways and to support one another. And we make promises to be to do what we can to promote and assist each other and our congregation in helping with our own problems and helping with the problems of the world. I see this as fundamentally covenantal in nature, but covenant means promises. It means you're agreeing to do something. It means that this is something you're accepting and taking on. And too often, covenant gets used more like rules. Once you covenant to something, you can be held to that covenant. And there are many situations of people being sort of battered and called out of covenant. In particular, where this has come to a head in a lot of UUA things, has with the UUA has taken a very strong position, which was voted on in the General Assembly, but that's another issue, that we will work on we will pursue anti-racism work within the concept of critical race theory and believing in that we live in a white supremacy culture. Not that we're all white supremacists, but that white supremacy is writ into the DNA of American life. And the UUA has very actively pursued that. And anybody who questions it, there's been a real risk that they've been called out of covenant. Now, that wasn't necessarily made as a covenantal agreement, but it was made as a ministerial strategy. And some people have been bashed pretty badly and pretty unfairly, I believe. Another word, well, I'll leave this one to Gray. I don't quite understand why transformative is a problem, but we'll get to that. And the other problem, the other buzzword that really has raised some hackles is, and it appears once in the very beginning of this thing, is accountability, where this is where my organization screwed up. If I turn this over, I'll find it. I read this very early on in section C22 under values and covenant. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Many people see that word accountability there as a threat, saying that UUA is going to hold congregations accountable for whether they do all these things right. I don't see that, but others do. And so that's a point of issue. Basically, what I do want to point out, and I think you got it from the way I read through these things, is almost all of the 7 principles appear in the language of this new document. And often the language is referential. It's taken directly from the principle and laid in here. And there are a few places where it's modified or changed. For example, inherent worth and dignity is changed to, I don't have the one where I've got everything underlined. And this is something we hear about. Thank you. Thank you. Every person, instead of saying we affirm in the inherent dignity of every person, or the inherent worth and dignity of every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. I don't think that weakens the idea. Some people do. To tell you the truth, one of the reasons it was changed was in some sectors of our association, there's an aversion to the word worth because we used to put value on human beings and sell them. Worthiness was considered a softer notion. And that's actually one of the reasons that was changed. But that's a discussion. So the words are changed a little bit. The tenor of them is changed. There's one, I see it as substantial change, and I don't know why. In fact, I'll shut up in a minute. I know I've been going on. And it's just, at some point, this stuff has to be said, and I don't know how else to do it. In the one principle from the original ones, let me find this, current Article 2, there we go. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. The new values and the description of them talk a lot about justice, but there is no mention of world community or peace. And to me, that's a significant omission. I think the interest in world peace and nonviolence and conflict resolution is very central to many of our congregants. And somebody is trying to frame an amendment that would put it back in a different way, where actually peace would become one of the values. So there would be 7 new ones instead of 6. This is commonly represented, and I don't have, if I had a slideshow here, I would have this here in pretty color. They like to put this out as a little flower. I don't know if anybody can see this, but this is the design, the logo attached to the new value thing, where a chalice with the word love is in the middle. And then it's surrounded by justice, interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, and generosity. Now, as I said, I got to shut up here. I think some of the opposition is heavily overstated. I don't think it's all wrong. And that's where the discussion comes in. And obviously, if somebody wants to make a point and argue a position, they tend to go for it. The process will continue. The deadline we're not going to make is any amendments to this proposal, and they are still allowed, have to be submitted by February 1st after being approved by at least 15 member congregations. Well, we missed that boat. We're not going to approve anything before February 1st that I'm aware of, unless I hear a real groundswell. But there are a few amendments that will be proposed and put forward that might slightly modify this. One of them is, as I mentioned, the Peace Amendment, which so far has 12, not 15 congregations in support of it. There is already one that's met that bar, and I can't even tell you what it is. It's got something to do with equity and equality, but I don't know the language of it. But anyhow, there will be some, and after February 1st, we will see what proposed amendments will be made to this. But this will be voted on this summer. Amendments require a three-fourths vote of the General Assembly to be added to this proposal. The whole proposal at large will be voted on and requires a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly. One of the things we need to do here is decide if we care. If this is desperately important to us, interesting to us, or somewhere out there in the UU world. And part of it is Beverly's been a fairly autonomous congregation in most of its time here, and it has had some relationship with things Unitarian, Universalist, and not never, recently hasn't been actively involved in the affairs of the association at all. Is that comfortable for us? Do we accept changes as they come to us, determined by those who are involved? If we want to totally ignore the UUA, I think that's a problem, because it says, well, why do we call ourselves Unitarian Universalist if we're not going to deal with the collective entity? But that's a discussion we can have. And under some models of this service, we were going to talk about some things this morning, but we're not, because I've kept you here too long already. We started late and went late. Greg wants one sentence. Go for it. Greg and I do not agree on all of these things, as you might guess. And he's the one person here that's very involved in the discussion.
I'm not going to, I have lots of comments I'm not going to make right now. Here's the thing I want people to think about when reading this. If you have a potential new person coming in who might be a member of this congregation, wants to know what it is, will this encourage them, discourage them? And if they're discouraged by them, do we want to be discouraging those people? And that's the simple question. Oops.
Because one of the biggest changes is we will actively work to include all people who will accept our values. And that's a change. And think through what that means. We know that we have excluded people in the past that didn't, but that was on a very person-to-person basis, having to do with difficult situations. At any rate, I'm done. I want people to read this. I will be announcing in the February contact a forum or two to discuss this for anybody who wants to go deeper into it. I can provide you with more information.